Hey guys, tonight we're diving into something that's less refreshing than your favorite beach vacation, medieval bathing habits. That's right, we're talking about the most unsanitary, soul-crushing, possibly toxic ways people tried to wash themselves back in the day. So before you get comfortable, take a second to like the video and subscribe, but only if you actually enjoy what I do here. Leave a comment telling me where you're listening from, and remember, no judgment on your bathing habits. It's all about those medieval peasant vibes tonight. Now dim the lights, turn on your fan for that soft white noise, and get cozy, because we're about to enter a world where personal hygiene is about as effective as a wet napkin. Let's pause for a second. Ever thought about how people in the past avoided getting seriously ill from bacteria? How did they survive when washing with water was as good as rubbing mud on your face? Did they just wear the same crusty tunic for years and hope for the best? Did they ever get that feeling you get when you accidentally spill soup on yourself? Except it was body odor and a mix of village sewage. And now, congratulations, you've just woken up in the year 1347. Welcome to the Dark Ages. You're covered in grime, your bath is a murky communal water source, and you're about to make a questionable decision with everyone else in your village. Good luck. You've seen public pools before, but medieval bathhouses? Think of them as the hot tub meets horror movies. Crowded, steamy, and filled with enough germs to make your skin crawl. Bathing was a social activity, sure, but it was also a breeding ground for every possible disease you could catch. Now picture this. It's the 14th century. You've had a rough week, dealing with an unreasonably long list of things that could kill you, like plague, famine, and the constant threat of accidental combustion. What better way to unwind than with a nice soak in the communal bathhouse, right? Wrong. The bathhouse was basically a petrified dish on steroids. These places were so popular, they were less of a spa and more of a shared infection zone. Everyone from your local blacksmith to the village priest was crammed together, stewing in the same hot water, floating around like human dumplings. That's the vibe. Let's talk hygiene, or the lack thereof. Imagine walking into a steam-filled room with dozens of people, all of whom are trying to wash off the grime from a hard day's work. Some may have even been wearing their work clothes. There's the smell of body odor, which, let's face it, had nowhere to go, mixed with something more unpleasant, the faint odor of human waste. Because guess what? People didn't exactly have indoor plumbing. Imagine trying to relax while sharing a pool with someone who just finished working in the fields. Now add some 90-degree water, floating debris, and a group of strangers squatting in your personal space. A perfect recipe for disease. Now you're thinking, okay, maybe it wasn't that bad. Surely they didn't just throw everyone into the same tub. Well, actually, they did. The bathhouse was essentially a public pool, but with one major difference. You couldn't just dip your toes in and leave. Once you were in, you were in. The concept of personal space didn't exist. Your personal bubble would have popped before you even had a chance to blow it up. People bathed together in the same water, some of them trying to wash off more than just dirt and sweat. They were trying to rid themselves of illnesses and possibly lice. You might have even been lucky enough to catch a disease simply by making eye contact with someone. To add to the fun, the water wasn't exactly clean. Sure, they might have poured in some fresh water every so often, but it was nothing like the modern-day filtration systems we've got now. Imagine soaking in a vat of lukewarm water that had been shared by hundreds of other people before you. Oh, and don't forget about the bacteria. Let's be real, the concept of clean was very different back then. It wasn't about scrubbing yourself with soap and water. It was about getting in and hoping for the best. And here's the best part. After all that, you didn't have towels to wrap yourself in. Nope. You had to rely on your clothes to absorb any moisture, which wasn't exactly the most comfortable option. So you're dripping wet, surrounded by strangers who probably haven't seen a toothbrush in a decade, and you're now expected to go back to your daily life, unscathed by whatever was lurking in that water. Spoiler alert, you probably weren't. You'd get sick, but hey, at least you could blame the bathhouse for your misery, right? Ever wonder how medieval people survived diseases like the plague? Maybe it was just a numbers game. You know, you catch a few bugs in the bathhouse, but you never know. Maybe that cold you got from that one really dirty guy was what actually helped build up your immune system. That, or you were just lucky to survive long enough to make it to the next bath. But despite all this, bathhouses weren't just about hygiene, or lack thereof. They were social hubs. People came together, exchanged news, and even flirted, because why not? It was where you could hear gossip, find out who was pregnant, and learn what the village blacksmith really thought about the baker's wife. It wasn't all bad. Sure, you had to risk a few infections, but hey, you could also catch up on your community's drama while trying to scrape off layers of grime that had probably been there for weeks. So there you have it. Medieval bathhouses weren't just about scrubbing off the dirt. They were more like a bacterial soup, mixed with the occasional conversation and maybe a few new ailments to take home with you. Still, it's probably better than just sitting in your filthy home all day. So in a way, the bathhouse was the 14th century version of treating yourself. Kind of. Let's face it though, given the choice between a medieval bathhouse and the comfort of your clean, modern shower, you know exactly where you'd be, and I can assure you, it's not there. So, you're a noble. The world's your oyster, right? Well, about that. Turns out, even royalty wasn't too keen on the whole cleanliness thing. Despite the fancy robes and grand castles, the whole bathing concept still involved a bucket and a lot of uncomfortable scrubbing. Now you might imagine that being a noble meant you'd get the finest luxuries, right? A golden bath, maybe? Some beautiful lavender-scented bubbles, perhaps? Think again. The royal bathing process was anything but glamorous. In fact, it was more akin to a medieval version of an impromptu spa day, without the spa, the relaxation, or any real chance of getting clean. The nobles might have lived in lavish castles, but their personal hygiene, well, it left much to be desired. Instead of the luxurious baths we imagine today, nobles were subjected to a similar fate to peasants when it came to getting clean, minus the communal bathhouse. Nobles were typically given a tub, and I use that term loosely, filled with lukewarm water, if they were lucky. Picture this. You're a noble. You've just had a long day of feasting, court politics, and pretending to be a decent human being, and now it's time to bathe. Well, prepare yourself for a bucket of water, maybe a little herbal mixture that probably did nothing, and a cloth, that's it. No golden faucets or marble showers, just a tub, possibly in a cold, damp room, where you strip down and hope that water is even remotely clean. Let's break down how this worked. You'd likely be assisted by a servant or two who would pour water over you, generously if you're lucky, then proceed to scrub you down with a rough cloth. The aim was to clean you, yes, but also to make you as uncomfortable as possible while doing so. It wasn't about relaxation, it was about getting through the process as quickly as possible. This is the kind of bath that makes you appreciate the 21st century version of luxury baths, where you can actually lie back without the fear of a servant dropping cold water all over your backside. What's even better is that while you're sitting in your semi-private cold tub, the smell of, well, you is likely lingering. Nobles, despite their status, didn't have access to proper soap. You're telling me that the king, who could command armies, wasn't also commanding some kind of high-quality body wash? Nope. Instead, they had to make do with soaps made from animal fat, ash, and maybe some herbs. It's the equivalent of smearing yourself with greasy mashed potatoes, hoping it does something for your skin. And yes, you guessed it, these soaps didn't exactly rinse well, leaving you feeling less fresh and more greasy. But fear not, royalty didn't always have to suffer in silence. Sometimes they would have the luxury of having a few servants stand by as the noble got a scrub down, like a glorified cleaning ritual. But this wasn't the spa-like luxury you'd imagine. There was no soft music, no bubbling water, no essential oils. Instead, there was a whole lot of awkwardness and probably some complaints. Imagine being scrubbed with a stiff brush, unable to move too much because, well, there's someone scrubbing your back while a second servant hovers nearby, and you can't even ask for a second helping of roast boar. And then there was the aftercare. After the uncomfortable scrubbing, it wasn't like you could simply wrap yourself in a cozy towel. No, in medieval times, towels were more like rough East burlap sacks that barely dried anything. Not exactly the soft, plush towels you'd expect after spending an hour in a hot tub. The nobles would be left to air dry or use one of their servants to pat them down, if they could stand the humiliation. It's like getting out of a modern-day shower and being handed a paper towel instead of a soft, fluffy bathrobe. Despite all this, nobles still managed to maintain their status in their not-so-clean state. The medieval world wasn't exactly concerned with fresh breath, glowing skin, or a lack of body odor. It was more about power, wealth, and whether you could maintain your dignity while looking like you'd just crawled out of a swamp. But here's the kicker. Despite their disregard for hygiene, nobles still thought they were above everyone else. They lived in castles, they wore fine clothes, and they convinced themselves that a little dirt never hurt anyone, especially if you had the right to throw a feast at the drop of a hat. Forget about the fact that your clothes probably smelled like last week's feast. It didn't matter as long as you had your title and a servant willing to scrub your back. So there you have it, medieval nobles, living in grand castles and feasting on the finest meats, still couldn't escape the inconvenient truth. They were as grimy as anyone else. With buckets of water, greasy soap, and servants doing their best to scrub away the discomfort, the so-called luxury bath was just another reminder that the Middle Ages were as charming as they were dirty. It's almost as if they had the money, but not the wisdom or the hygiene products to back it up. Wouldn't you rather just get a nice hot shower by yourself and call it a day? Yeah, me too. If you think water was the go-to for washing, think again. Medieval folk often used whatever liquid was closest. From the occasional splash of wine to mystery concoctions that probably shouldn't be allowed near your skin, this is how medieval hygiene was done. Let's be clear here. Water wasn't exactly in abundance in the Middle Ages. Sure, there were rivers and streams, But the idea of having fresh, clean water at your disposal, that was a luxury reserved for the upper crust, and even then it wasn't exactly pristine. But for the average peasant, a good wash meant working with what they had. And sometimes, what they had was not something you'd want to touch with a 10-foot pole. Enter wine. Yes, wine. No, it wasn't because people thought it was luxurious. They weren't that fancy. The truth is, wine, especially red wine, was far more accessible than fresh, filtered water. Now imagine this. You've been toiling away in the fields all day, covered in dirt, sweat, and possibly a bit of other substances. Because let's face it, you've got some unclean livestock to deal with. You've decided it's time to clean up, so instead of a bucket of water, what you've got is a bucket of wine. Does it clean you? Probably not as well as you'd hope, but it might get you a little tipsy while you're at it, so you can forget about the fact that your skin might just look like it's been pickled, and because the alcohol could kill some bacteria, they probably thought it was the next best thing to a proper bath. But if you think this is strange, remember that the ancient Egyptians, Greeks, and Romans were also big fans of soaking in wine. Maybe they were onto something, or maybe they were just really into drinking, but that's just the beginning. There were other, even stranger liquids used in medieval baths. You'd have to be somewhat brave or desperate to use these, but they were still part of the medieval hygiene repertoire. Take, for example, the bizarre mixtures made from herbs, oils, and sometimes animal fats. Picture this. You're being scrubbed with a mixture of bear fat or some other animal's fat, combined with herbs that are supposed to clean you, but honestly, just leave you smelling like a soup you wouldn't even feed your dog. But hey, it was better than nothing, right? If you weren't lucky enough to have someone throw you in a tub of wine or grease-based concoction, you could always go for some unfiltered river water, which is really just a different kind of adventure. This water, of course, was shared with everyone and everything: livestock, wild animals, and perhaps the occasional dead body. Let's be real, it could happen. So when medieval folk took a dip in a river to clean themselves, they weren't just getting wet. They were probably soaking in a stew of whatever the river had collected in the past 24 hours. Leaves, debris, and yes, human waste. Maybe you felt a bit cleaner afterwards, but you were more likely to leave the river with a few new diseases under your belt. What about the really luxurious folk, the nobles? Well, they still had it rough. They might have access to slightly cleaner water, but instead of washing away the grime of the day, they were often soaking in water that had been flavored with herbs or other mystery ingredients. These potions were meant to make the water more refreshing, but all they did was add more to the funky mix you were already sitting in. Some nobles even added a bit of rosewater, probably because they thought it would make them smell better, but I doubt it was much of a match for the smell that was already lingering on their clothes. Of course, the grandest bath of all, reserved for kings and queens, was more like a glorified wet nap. They'd have heated water poured in from massive buckets, and after a nice long soak, they'd be scrubbed down, not by themselves, of course, but by their loyal servants, who probably hated every minute of it. But this wasn't the same as our modern self-care baths with aromatherapy candles and soft music playing. This was a matter of survival, hoping that something in that greasy, herb-filled water would magically wipe away the dirt and leave you feeling clean, when really, you were probably just greased up and more prone to attracting flies. And the whole process, from beginning to end, was far less about hygiene and far more about social status. If you could afford to bathe, then you were clearly living the good life, even if that bath involved a blend of whatever liquid you could get your hands on. But the fact remains, medieval folks were just doing the best they could with what they had. And what they had, honestly, wasn't much. So the next time you step into your shower, remember that it could have been worse. You could have been stuck in a cold river bath surrounded by the local livestock, or you could have had to scrub yourself down with a wine-soaked rag. If you're lucky enough to have clean, hot water, maybe give a little thanks to the medieval who had to make do with whatever liquids were in reach. Let's be real, no one wants lice, but in medieval times, lice was like a free gift with every haircut. Imagine scratching your head in the bath, only to realize you've just invited a whole colony to the party. Now let's take a step back for a moment and picture this. It's the 14th century. You're living your best medieval life, working hard, probably smelling like an unwashed potato sack, and battling the daily dangers of living in a world with no antibiotics, no running water, and no reliable dental care. But you know what? You're still managing. You've got your tunic on, your trusty leather shoes, which may or may not have just been a skinned animal, and you've just treated yourself to a bath in some lukewarm river water. You think you've got it all figured out, but surprise, your hair feels a little itchier than usual. Uh-oh, you've got lice. This isn't just any ordinary bug problem either. Medieval lice were like the uninvited guest at a party. You're hosting in your own scalp, except the guest refuses to leave. The lice didn't care whether you were a peasant or a noble. They didn't discriminate. Whether you were rolling around in a public bath with half the village or lounging in your cozy, well, sort of castle, they were everywhere. And the worst part? You had to live with them, because lice shampoo wasn't exactly a thing in medieval times. Back then, personal hygiene was a luxury, not a necessity. So while today we throw on our best anti-lice treatments at the first sign of an itch, medieval folk were stuck with a much more rudimentary approach. Think about it. The average medieval person didn't have the luxury of a hot private bath and a perfectly sanitized bathroom. Most people had to get by with whatever was available: herbs, foul-smelling oils, or maybe, just maybe, an occasional comb through to try and remove the critters. But lice don't really care about combs. They're pretty persistent little creatures. In fact, medieval people probably just accepted lice as part of life. It wasn't a big deal in their day-to-day existence. It was just another form of discomfort to be tolerated. The reality is that medieval societies were covered in filth, literally. People didn't have the benefit of personal hygiene the way we do now, so bugs, especially lice, were pretty much part of the deal. You'd probably walk around in a dusty, filthy environment, sleep on straw, which was probably swarming with its own bugs, and then get lice as a bonus. They didn't come in the cute, trendy, lice-free box that we dream of in modern times. These little guys just saw an opportunity, and they took it. But hey, if you didn't have lice, there were other charming critters to contend with. Bedbugs, fleas, mites. What's the difference, right? It was a whole package of gross, tiny creatures just waiting to set up shop in your body and or clothes. And the worst part? You couldn't exactly escape them by taking off your tunic and grabbing a fresh one. You were stuck in a world of itchy, uncomfortable, bug-filled misery. Imagine having your own body act as a hotel for pests without a checkout date. Great, right? And then there's the matter of your hair. You might have thought you'd just wash it and get back to your day, But that's not how lice work. They don't just hang out on the surface. They make their little homes in the hair follicles, which means every time you tried to wash your hair, you were likely just inviting them to stay longer. Medieval people didn't have conditioners or special lice shampoos to take care of this. So once you had lice, it was just part of the charming package deal of medieval life. Now, if you were lucky enough to be one of the more affluent nobles, you might have had the luxury of a personal groomer who tried to keep things a little cleaner. However, even royal lice were persistent, sitting pretty in the silks and velvet, enjoying the soft luxury while their owners tried, unsuccessfully, to stop the invasion. It's not like nobles could just throw on a hat and call it a day. That would have been a social faux pas. Instead, they had to rely on whatever the best option was at the time: combing, oiling, or possibly just suffering through it. And let's not forget about the remedy options. Medieval remedies for lice were, to put it mildly, questionable. They might have applied a greasy mixture of herbs or animal fats to their scalps in a feeble attempt to suffocate the lice. Imagine having to sit through that while the stuff slowly makes your scalp itch even more, or worse, clogs your pores and leaves you with a sticky mess in your hair. Not exactly the spa day we all dream of, right? In short, lice weren't just a nuisance. They were a way of life in medieval times. They were just another reality to face when you woke up each morning, probably itchy and uncomfortable, with no escape. But hey, at least they weren't as bad as what you probably smelled like after a long day of work. Am I right? So the next time you get frustrated over a pesky itch, just remember the medieval folks who lived with lice like they were part of the family. Because at least today, we've got lice treatment and proper hygiene practices. Two things medieval life definitely did not have. They had soap, well, sort of. It was less bubble bath and more sticky, smelly mess, usually made from animal fat and ash. It's the kind of soap that leaves you questioning if cleanliness is overrated. Now let's set the scene here. It's the 14th century. You've just wrapped up a long, sweaty day of labor. Your hands are grimy. Your face feels like it's been used as a doormat, and naturally, you're in the mood for a refreshing bath to clean up. But surprise, the soap you're about to use looks more like a chunk of greasy animal fat than anything remotely close to your modern-day, lemon-scented, sudsy dream. And to top it off, the smell? Let's just say it doesn't exactly scream luxury. It's the kind of scent that makes you wonder if clean really even matters at this point. Medieval soap was an experience, but not in a good way. Instead of the silky suds we're accustomed to, medieval folks had to make do with a mixture of animal fat, sometimes rendered from pigs or goats, and ash. This soap wasn't bubbly, frothy, or silky smooth. It was thick, greasy, and honestly kind of disgusting. And the worst part? It didn't even rinse well. After you smeared it on your skin, you were basically left with a thin layer of grease that wouldn't come off, no matter how much you scrubbed. Here's the kicker. Not only did this soap not clean you, but it also had the lovely side effect of sticking to your skin. Imagine rubbing it in, only to find that you've just made yourself stickier than before, with a smell that was, let's just say, less than pleasant. It's like trying to scrub off a coating of motor oil with a rag that's already covered in the stuff. The result wasn't exactly the fresh, clean feeling you get after a nice modern shower. It was more like you just painted yourself with an oily film and hoped for the best. And don't even get me started on how they used this soap. There was no convenient pump bottle or easy-to-use bar. You'd have to scoop up some of the greasy concoction, probably with your hands, since you didn't exactly have access to washcloths or sponges, and try to apply it without getting your hands too oily. It wasn't a matter of gently massaging in some bubbles. It was about slathering yourself in this greasy mess, all while hoping that something resembling cleanliness would eventually come from it. Spoiler alert, it didn't. The worst part? Even after applying this sticky mess, you were supposed to rinse it off. However, considering medieval people didn't have modern plumbing, the concept of rinsing was pretty much an afterthought. If you were lucky, you'd get a bucket of water thrown over you after you smeared the soap on, but chances were that water was just as dirty as the soap. That's right. Rinsing with the same grimy water you'd used for the bath was basically the medieval way of saying, "We tried, but you're still going to stink." But let's be real for a moment. What was the alternative? Soap was such a luxury back then that even if it didn't really clean you, it still gave you a better shot than just being dirty all the time. People didn't have access to soap the way we do now, and they definitely didn't have fancy ingredients like glycerin, aloe, or lavender to soften the experience. It was animal fat, ash, and, if you were lucky, a few herbs thrown in to mask the smell. Interestingly enough, medieval soap wasn't all bad in theory. It did, in fact, have some mild cleaning properties, because animal fat combined with alkaline substances, like ash, could to some degree break down grease and grime. But the reality was that the soap wasn't nearly as effective as modern-day products. It was like trying to wash your car with a dirty rag and expecting it to come out shiny. So in essence, it was less clean and more get by. If you were hoping for a refreshing experience, you were out of luck. And then there's the scent issue. Modern soap has perfumes designed to make you smell like a blooming meadow or a tropical paradise. But medieval soap it had the smell of animal fat and ash, with perhaps a hint of herbal attempts to cover it up. Imagine the worst part of cooking bacon for hours on end mixed with burnt toast, and that was your bath fragrance. So after you got out of your bath, you weren't exactly the picture of cleanliness. You were just a walking greasy mess, smelling like the side of a butcher shop. But here's where it gets even more ironic. Medieval folks still thought this was the best they had. If you lived back then, you didn't even know what modern soap was like. You were just trying to survive the day, and if that meant getting your skin slathered in a mixture of fat and ash, then so be it. Maybe that's why they didn't mind the smell or the feeling of the grease sticking to their skin. It was all part of their reality. After all, soap was a luxury, even if it didn't really work. So the next time you step into your luxurious shower with your fragrant body wash and perfect lather, just remember, medieval folks were probably dealing with a greasy, sticky concoction made of animal fat and ash, and they still had to go on with their day. If that doesn't make you appreciate modern hygiene, I don't know what will. Forget tubs, forget privacy. Peasants were lucky to get any water at all. Imagine scraping off grime with nothing but a rough cloth and hoping the gods don't strike you down with plague for your laziness. Now let's be clear. If you were a medieval peasant, personal hygiene wasn't exactly a priority. You had bigger problems to worry about, like whether your crops would survive the next frost, or if you'd be eaten by wolves on your way home. Taking a bath wasn't a simple matter of hopping into a warm tub filled with lavender-scented bubbles. Oh no, my friend. For peasants, bathing was about as luxurious as finding a needle in a haystack, and just as painful. Well, picture it. You've been working the fields all day covered in dirt, sweat, and probably something less pleasant. You're hot, tired, and filthy, but a bath? Forget it. If you're lucky, there's a community well, and if you're even luckier, you might get a little water from it to rinse off. But don't get your hopes up. This isn't the type of water we think of today. This water could have been shared with livestock, had a bit of extra murk from the village, and possibly had a dead rat or two floating in it. The bath was less about relaxation and more about survival. You might pour the water over yourself, but it is more likely to just make you smell worse as you try to shake off layers of filth that have been building up for days, maybe even weeks. If you're thinking, well, surely they had some kind of soap to help, you're out of luck. Soap was a rare luxury, and when it did exist, it was often a sticky, greasy mess made from animal fat and ash. So no, there's no lavender body wash in this scenario. Instead, peasants were left to their own devices with nothing but a rough cloth to scrub away the grime. Imagine trying to wipe off a week's worth of dirt with a scratchy rag. Now imagine doing that without access to hot water, soap, or anything remotely pleasant. You'd be lucky if the rag didn't just rub the dirt deeper into your skin. But hey, it was better than nothing, right? And forget about privacy. In the medieval peasant world, personal space was practically non-existent. You'd live in a small, cramped house with multiple family members and probably some farm animals. If you wanted to wash off, you'd have to strip down, probably in front of everyone in the house, and pray they didn't notice your questionable hygiene. The concept of private bathing didn't exist. If there was water, it was a communal experience. You shared the same water source as your neighbors, your livestock, and possibly any other creatures that happened to wander by. The idea of a bathroom or a private space was completely foreign. Everyone was in the same stinky boat, just trying to survive. Now let's say you did manage to scrape off enough dirt to feel a little fresher. Congratulations, you weren't exactly clean, but you probably felt less like a walking pile of mud. However, that didn't mean you were hygienic. Remember, this was a time when diseases were rampant, and hygiene practices weren't nearly as developed as they are today. No amount of water or cloth could protect you from the real dangers of the time: lice, fleas, and an array of infections. If you had a cut, there was no antiseptic to make sure it didn't turn into a nasty infection. You just hope it healed on its own. If you were one of the luckier peasants, maybe your family had a herbal remedy that could kind of help, but let's be honest, medicine was a bit of a guessing game. Oh, and the fun didn't stop there. Let's talk about hair. Imagine trying to clean your hair with nothing but a greasy cloth and no shampoo. It wasn't as if you could just pop into a village shop for some magical hair products. Hair was often tangled, dirty, and infested with lice. And while nobles might have had servants to comb through their hair with oils and perfumes, peasants were stuck with scratching their heads and hoping the lice would eventually get bored and leave. Spoiler alert, they didn't. But there was an upside, sort of. Medieval peasants were tough. They didn't have the luxury of a relaxing bath after a long day. They didn't have fluffy towels, clean water, or soothing scents. What they had was grit, survival, and a kind of hygiene that was based entirely on getting by. If you made it through the day without succumbing to disease, you were doing better than most. The concept of clean wasn't something they aspired to. It was about being alive. You didn't smell fresh, but you smelled like everyone else, so it was just part of life. So the next time you're in the shower, surrounded by luxury, remember this. Medieval peasants weren't just fighting the elements, hunger, or disease. They were fighting their own sweat, dirt, and a lack of basic hygiene tools. They didn't have the luxury of a hot shower, soap, or even privacy. What they had was a rough cloth and a prayer that the gods didn't strike them down for the sheer audacity of being dirty. It wasn't pretty, but it was survival. And maybe, just maybe, that's what we should remember next time we complain about a little sweat on a summer day. Want to know what medieval success smelled like? If you guessed a mix of sweat, manure, and the faint stench of unwashed socks, you'd be spot on. Forget deodorant. The real trick was avoiding people long enough so they couldn't smell you. Now imagine you're a medieval peasant. Your life is spent working the land, herding animals, or laboring in the heat, and hygiene isn't exactly at the top of your to-do list. There's no fresh-smelling body wash, no deodorant to save the day, and certainly no fancy perfume bottles sitting on your bathroom counter. Instead, you're left with something much more natural. The scent of medieval success wasn't something you'd want to bottle. It was a potent combination of sweat, animal dung, and the lingering aroma of weeks, or maybe even months, of not bathing. Bathing? Sure, it happened, but it wasn't the frequent, refreshing experience we're familiar with today. If you were lucky enough to have access to water, you might have used it to wash away a bit of the dirt and grime. But in a world where water was often shared by entire communities and sometimes animals, clean wasn't really something you could achieve. The smell? Well, it was the smell of survival. The idea of stepping into a shower with fresh, hot water or spraying yourself with your favorite cologne would have been a fantasy so far out of reach. It'd make you question if you were even living in the same world. In fact, most people just learn to live with it. Think about it. Without deodorant, without proper bathing, and without any real way of masking body odor, the best you could do was pray that no one got too close. It was a kind of scent diplomacy. If you could manage to keep a safe distance between yourself and others, then everyone would be content to pretend you didn't smell like a human compost pile. But the reality, well, medieval people didn't really have the luxury of maintaining personal space. And without any deodorant to mask the stench, it was the real test of social interaction. People in the medieval era would have had to embrace the smell of their own sweat, because honestly, there was no escaping it. Deodorant wasn't a thing, so medieval folk had to rely on whatever they could find to cover the stench. Herbs, oils, and sometimes flowers. But that wasn't exactly effective, was it? You see, the herbs and flowers might have been nice for a quick mask, but they weren't going to hold up to an entire day of hard labor in the fields. And those herbal remedies didn't exactly kill the bacteria causing body odor. They just gave it a nice floral backdrop. But hey, this wasn't just a peasant problem. Nobles too had to face the harsh reality of medieval hygiene. They might have had a little more access to fresh water, maybe a nice bowl of rose water for a quick refresh, but even their royal smells weren't much better. The idea of smelling like a fresh garden was a luxury in itself. For the nobility, at best, they could manage to cover their body odor with heavy perfumes or oils, which, let's face it, often mixed with the natural scent of unwashed skin, making it all smell like a very, very weird potpourri. It wasn't exactly Chanel, if you catch my drift. And then there's the fact that most medieval people didn't have access to fancy fabrics or fresh clothes. If you worked the fields or did laborious work in the medieval period, your clothing wasn't exactly breathable. This meant you were likely stuck in the same tunic for days, maybe weeks at a time. The combination of body odor and a lack of fresh clothes must have been a sensory experience only rivaled by standing in a crowded room with your least favorite relatives. So what did you do if you wanted to socialize in medieval times? The answer is simple. You learned to deal with it. You probably hoped that the people around you were too polite or too stinky themselves to notice the overpowering scent that wafted from your body. If you had to attend a feast or a royal event, you might have been able to cover your odor with some flowers or herbs in your hair, but you could bet your last coin that people were still taking in a big whiff of that glorious medieval funk. The truth is, medieval people didn't have the luxury of worrying about their smell. They had far bigger things to deal with, like surviving plague outbreaks, famine, and constantly battling the elements. Smelling fresh and clean was about as realistic as owning a unicorn. Hygiene, in the medieval sense, was an afterthought, not an expectation. The closest thing to freshness was probably the smell of food cooking over an open fire, and honestly, that was probably your best shot at smelling halfway decent. And you know what? They just got used to it. In a world where survival depended on more pressing matters, personal scent was a low priority. The medieval scent of success wasn't about impressing others or leaving a lasting fragrance behind. It was about getting through the day, making it to the next one, and hoping you didn't get too close to someone who was really bad off. So the next time you spray on your favorite deodorant and step into your air-conditioned house, remember, it could have been worse. You could have been a medieval peasant, living your best life while smelling like a barn. Sure, river baths sound refreshing, but did you know the river was also used for, other activities? Yep, that water might have been refreshing for your skin, but it could have also been someone's laundry, sewage, or who knows, a random dead animal floating by. Now let's talk about rivers in the medieval era. Today, we think of a nice river as a serene, peaceful place where we can dip our toes or even take a relaxing swim. But in medieval times, rivers were a whole different story. The water? Oh, it was anything but clean. People weren't exactly concerned with filtering or purifying the water. They were just trying to survive. So the same river that was your bath was also likely being used for a whole lot of other things that would make you want to steer clear of it. For starters, rivers were everywhere, and they were essential for life. But they were also shared by entire villages. Humans, animals, and nature all crammed together in one place. That means when you went down to the river for a bath, you weren't just getting clean water. You were probably sharing that water with everything from your neighbors to their livestock and anything in between. The river was essentially a giant communal space for everyone, including farm animals. Just imagine what you were floating around with: the local cows, horses, pigs, and chickens all washing off the grime of their daily activities. It's not exactly the picture of a relaxing spa day, is it? And that's not all. Have you ever thought about what goes into the river besides dirty water? Medieval rivers were often the dumping ground for all sorts of stuff. Sewage? Yep, that was going straight into the water. Your daily waste, your neighbor's waste, maybe even the waste of the local blacksmith Whatever wasn't just flushed away, because, surprise, there were no toilets, ended up in the river. The result? Well, let's just say the river was not the clean, inviting place you'd want to go for a refreshing dip. You weren't just washing off the day's sweat. You were probably getting a dose of something a lot less desirable. Oh, and let's not forget about the laundry. You might have thought washing your clothes in the river was a clever use of resources. After all, it's water, right? But when everyone in the village, including your neighbor, the butcher, and the miller, uses the same water to clean their clothes, the water starts getting a little grungy. All those soap suds from the homemade soap, mixed with dirt, sweat, and a dash of, well, animal urine? Not exactly your dream bathwater. And as if things couldn't get any worse, let's talk about dead animals. That's right. Rivers back in the medieval era were the perfect place for a good old float. Whether it was a stray sheep that fell in, or heaven forbid, a horse that drowned, the river became the final resting place for a lot of things that didn't exactly belong there. So, you're in the river, trying to wash off your day's hard work, and what's that floating by? Is it a dead squirrel? Maybe a random carcass from the butcher? Congratulations, you've got yourself a surprise river companion. But despite all the nasty surprises lurking in the river, people still relied on it for their cleaning rituals. It wasn't like they had much of a choice. If you were a peasant, getting a bath wasn't exactly a luxury. It was a rare occasion when you were able to wash the grime of a long day off your body. And if that meant standing in freezing cold water with God knows what else, then so be it. The idea of clean water was a distant dream. The bath wasn't meant to be a relaxing experience. It was more about just getting by. The water wasn't there to pamper you. It was there to do the bare minimum. Get your body clean enough to survive another day of manual labor. Forget about bubbles or warm water. It was about braving the river with a grimace and hoping you didn't catch anything worse than a few waterlogged socks. And then there were the after effects. After you'd scrubbed off as much dirt as you could, you were left with wet, soggy clothes and probably some nasty rashes, as the water didn't do much to cleanse your skin, just leaving it feeling sticky in all the wrong ways. So while you might have been able to rinse off the surface grime, you weren't exactly leaving the river smelling like roses. You probably just smelled wet, muddy, slightly less dirty, you. So the next time you step into a fresh, chlorinated pool or take a long, steamy shower, just remember, medieval people didn't have that luxury. Their baths came with a hefty side of nature's surprises. Rivers weren't the tranquil, refreshing spaces we envision today. They were the unsanitary, unpredictable, and often disgusting spots where survival met hygiene, whether you liked it or not. Let's just say it was a good thing they didn't have Instagram, or the Knowledge River Bath Challenge would have been way too real. There were fountains, right? Public ones that everyone could use, whether they were thirsty or in need of a cleaning. But the thing is, the water was often shared with farm animals and anyone else in the village, so good luck with that. Imagine it. You're a medieval peasant, trudging through another long, dirty day of work. Your skin is caked in dirt, your hair is a tangled mess, and you're probably covered in some mystery substance you'd rather not think about too much. But fear not. There's a fountain in the center of town, a communal water source that promises to solve all your hygiene problems, or so you think. At first glance, a public fountain might seem like a lifeline. After all, it's water, and you need water to survive, right? But let's pause for a moment and think about what that water actually is. Public fountains in medieval towns weren't the quaint, carefully maintained places we see today. They were usually little more than a spout of water from a public well or natural spring available to everyone in the village. Sounds nice, right? Not so fast. If you were planning to take a nice drink or a refreshing splash, you'd better think twice about who or what else had been using that water. For starters, fountains weren't just for people. Oh no, you might be sharing that clean water with all kinds of farm animals. Picture it, the local goats, chickens, and pigs all crowding around the same fountain, taking a sip, or perhaps splashing around without any thought of hygiene. And guess what? They didn't wash their hooves before jumping in. If you were lucky, the animals had been kept somewhat clean, but we're talking about the medieval world here, where cleanliness wasn't a top priority for anyone, animal or human. This was the 14th century, not a petting zoo with high standards for animal hygiene. So if you were using the same water for your bath or drink as the livestock, enjoy that splash of animal germs with your refreshing dip. But wait, there's more. In a bustling medieval village, these fountains were often the only source of water for everyone, which meant everyone used them for everything. Drinking, washing hands, doing laundry, cleaning vegetables, and yes, getting a bath if you were desperate enough. You can imagine how clean that water stayed with everyone, human and animal, doing their best, or worst, to make it their own. It wasn't like today, where we have separate systems for drinking water and bathing. Back then, a communal fountain was your one-stop shop for all things liquid. Let's talk about those baths for a second. If you were a peasant in need of a quick rinse, you'd make your way to the fountain, strip down, because privacy, what's that? And dip into the public water source to wash off. You'd probably share the space with a few others. No sense in being modest after all. And while you were trying to clean yourself off, you might have noticed a floating piece of something that wasn't quite soap. Maybe it was a rag that had been used for something else, or perhaps you'd spot a leaf or twig caught in the current. Whatever it was the least of your worries. You weren't exactly scrubbing your body with fresh, filtered water. Instead, you were just trying to get through the day with as little smell as possible. Now imagine the scent of that water. It wasn't going to be the refreshing smell of spring rain or the scent of fresh flowers. No, this water probably had a lot of character. Between the animals, the laundry, and the daily human use, the water had taken on a life of its own. It might have smelled faintly like sweat, soap, and, well, whatever was in the water that day. It certainly wasn't anything close to the pristine, clean water we're used to today. But back then, it was as good as it got. If you wanted a bath, you had to accept that the water might not smell like roses. It might smell more like a public fountain. And that's what hygiene looked like in the medieval world. Let's not forget the other fun surprise of using communal fountains: the disease. Rivers and public water sources weren't exactly known for their cleanliness, and medieval folk weren't particularly concerned with sterilization or purification. Without modern filtration, diseases like cholera and dysentery could spread through public water sources like wildfire. You might feel cleaner after splashing in the fountain, but there was a chance you'd end up sick from the very water you used to wash away the grime of the day. But despite all the risks, the public fountain was the medieval version of a bath for most people. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't hygienic, and it certainly wasn't private, but it was accessible, So while you're lounging in your perfectly temperature-controlled shower with all your luxurious products, take a moment to appreciate the fact that you're not trying to freshen up in a public fountain, sharing the space with animals, laundry, and a potential case of plague. Just another reminder that hygiene in the medieval era was a whole different ballgame. Forget lathering and rinsing. Medieval folk scrubbed with a tool so hard, it probably gave them more bruises than cleanliness. Getting dirt off was as much about endurance as it was about hygiene. Now imagine it. A long day in the fields, your skin thick with a layer of sweat, dust, and, well, probably a few other substances you don't want to think too hard about. You've worked through the heat, and now you're ready to wash off all that grime. But instead of heading to a shower with a nice bottle of body wash, you've got something a little more primitive in mind. A wooden tool, maybe some rough fabric, and absolutely no luxury. Hygiene in medieval times wasn't about comfort. It was about getting through the day without being too filthy. You didn't just hop into a warm, bubbly bath. There were no sponges, no loofahs, and certainly no exfoliating scrubs. Nope. Instead, you grabbed a tool, often a scraper, which was exactly what it sounds like, a rough, sometimes sharp object that was intended to scrape away the layer of dirt that had settled on your skin. It wasn't gentle, it wasn't soothing. It was basically medieval DIY exfoliation with an added bonus of potential pain. The scraper might have been made of wood, bone, or metal, and its job was to scrape away all the built-up grime and sweat. And we're not talking about a gentle rub down. No, this was the kind of scraping that probably left bruises behind as much as it did cleanliness. The idea behind it was simple. Get the dirt off as quickly as possible so you could get back to the grind. If you were lucky, you had access to a communal wash basin or a river where you could splash some water on yourself, but good luck with that if you were one of the lower class. If you didn't have the luxury of running water or the time to sit in a bath, which you almost certainly didn't, your best bet was a quick scrape with whatever tool you had at hand. No soothing scrubs or soft or brushes, just the sound of scraping, the discomfort of your skin getting roughed up, and the hope that you were getting rid of enough dirt to not smell like a walking manure pile. Let's pause for a second and think about the joy of this process. Medieval people didn't have modern showers, bath products, or even the luxury of a warm private space to clean themselves. Instead, they had to make do with whatever water they could scrounge up and a tool that was probably about as effective at scrubbing as a rock is at polishing a diamond. The scraping process wasn't just about cleanliness, it was an endurance test. You weren't only scraping dirt off your skin, you were also scraping away the discomfort of knowing that, no matter how hard you worked at it, you probably weren't going to get clean the way we think of it today. The scrape wasn't just to remove dirt either. It could also help with dead skin, you know, the kind that builds up after a long, hard day of work in the elements. But here's the catch. Even if you managed to scrape off a layer of dead skin, there was no guarantee that you were going to smell any better. If the water you had to wash with was dirty or shared with livestock, you weren't exactly coming out of that bath smelling like a flower. You were just less dirty, maybe. But of course, this scraping ritual was common for people of all social classes. Nobles, too, would have undergone some form of this cleaning process. It wasn't that they had much better access to cleanliness. They just had slightly more luxurious methods. They might have had soft cloths instead of scraping with bone, but they weren't exactly using fluffy towels or luxurious body scrubs. If you were a noble, you might get a gentle scrape, a splash of rose water, or a wash with a finer cloth, but it was still a far cry from the easy, refreshing shower we're accustomed to. Instead, you were left trying to scrub away layers of grime, hoping for some semblance of cleanliness. But what about the more refined people in society, like the clergy or royals? Well, their bathing methods didn't exactly involve sitting in warm baths surrounded by scented candles. They might have had servants who helped with their cleanliness, but they still had to go through the same grueling scraping process. Sure, their scrapers might have been made of more luxurious materials, but the process itself wasn't much different from what a peasant would go through. Everyone in medieval society was stuck with the same basic hygiene struggle. And let's not forget the worst part of all this. You weren't just battling dirt and grime. You were also contending with things like lice and fleas. The scraping process might have removed dirt, but it wasn't going to rid you of these delightful little companions. That meant that even after you finished scraping off all the visible dirt, there was still the very real chance that you were walking around with lice in your hair, fleas in your clothes, and general discomfort everywhere. So the next time you complain about having to exfoliate or scrub the grime from your own skin, remember, medieval folk were scraping themselves raw just to survive the day without feeling like they were living in a pile of dirt. It wasn't about luxury. It was about making it through another day of discomfort, hard work, and, well, surviving in a world where the concept of clean was a lot more flexible than it is today. Perfumes in medieval times didn't exactly mask the stink. They just replaced one bad smell with another. Imagine walking around smelling like a mix of roses and death. Not exactly the pleasant aroma you'd expect. Let's set the scene. You're a noble living in the 14th century, and you've had a long day. You've been to court, had a feast, and maybe even made a few political alliances. You're feeling pretty important, but there's one little problem. You smell like a farm, and not the sweet, idyllic kind of farm either. The kind where the pigs are kept a bit too close to the barn and the cows haven't been milked in a while. So, what do? You can't exactly just hop in the shower or toss on some deodorant like we would today. No, your solution is much more fragrant. Perfume, in the medieval world, was used in a very different way than we think of it today. Back then, perfumes weren't about subtlety or making you smell like a blooming flower. They were about drowning out the stench of the actual smell of you and everyone else. The concept of personal hygiene was still quite primitive, so the idea of using a delicate scent to complement your fresh and clean body, that was as far removed from reality as possible. The real goal was to cover up the not-so-delicate odors of unwashed bodies, sweat, animals, and food, all of which were always present in everyday life. Instead of light, airy fragrances like we enjoy today, medieval perfumes were often heavy, overpowering concoctions of herbs, oils, and flowers. These perfumes were thick, often sticky, and loaded with the strong, pungent smells of rose, lavender, and spices. The problem with this? They didn't cover the stink. They just piled another layer of scent on top of it, making the whole experience even worse. Imagine walking into a room where someone's tried to mask the smell of their unwashed body by slathering on a few too many dabs of rose water, and you get the picture. It didn't make you smell clean. It just made you smell different. The mix of rotting meat, farm animals, and your own sweat was still there. only now it had the faintest hint of flowers, or what was supposed to pass as flowers. But perfumes weren't just for the wealthy. Everyone used them to some degree, though the quality varied wildly depending on your social class. Peasants, for example, might not have had access to the rich, heavily scented perfumes made with oils from exotic plants. Instead, they might have used herbs or natural substances like vinegar or scented oils, both of which did little to mask their true scent. While peasants were working in the fields, getting covered in mud and manure, their perfumes of choice was the smell of the earth and sweat, and maybe a handful of herbs tied together and stuffed into their clothing to try to make them smell less like the world they worked in. Now, let's talk about the complexity of medieval perfumery. The art of making perfumes was a bit like brewing a potion. Exotic oils, often imported from distant lands, were combined with herbs, spices, and sometimes even animal fats. Ambergris, for instance, was a sought-after perfume ingredient. This strange, waxy substance was collected from the intestines of sperm whales. Yes, you read that correctly. So if you thought your modern-day bottle of perfume was strange, it's nothing compared to the sheer oddity of medieval fragrance. Some scents were even made with substances that today would be considered questionable at best. So while it might smell flowery on top, there was always something more disturbing underneath. But despite how cloying and overwhelming these medieval perfumes could be, they served a very important purpose: social status. Perfume was a way of demonstrating wealth and sophistication, even if you were still just a few days away from needing a good scrub. In the royal courts, people often wore layers of scent to make sure no one noticed the grime that accumulated from a lack of proper bathing. Nobles might have had their own personal bathers, attendants who helped them stay clean enough to wear these heavy artificial scents. But let's face it, unless you had access to a constant flow of fresh water, your perfume was really just a coat of paint, covering up the unavoidable stench of medieval life. Interestingly, perfume also had a practical use in medieval times, beyond mere vanity. Many believed that fragrances could help ward off disease, particularly the plague. The idea was that sweet-smelling herbs and flowers could protect you from the miasma, the bad air thought to cause sickness. People would carry fragrant herbs like rosemary, lavender, and thyme in their pockets, or hang them around their necks, hoping to fend off the disease. Spoiler alert, it didn't work, but it sure made them smell better. Despite all of its strong, sometimes repellent qualities, perfume was an essential part of the medieval worlds. It was both a necessity and a luxury, an artifice that helped mask the reality of a world without proper hygiene, water, or even the concept of regular bathing. So the next time you spritz yourself with your favorite floral scent, take a moment to thank the modern-day deodorant gods, because in the medieval world, nobody was going to smell like fresh roses, and that's an understatement. Picture this. It's your wedding day. You've got your fancy dress, your guests are arriving, and the scent in the air is, well, special. Why bathe when you could get married and just hope your partner doesn't mind? Now, we all know that weddings are supposed to be a time of celebration, joy, and a fresh start for the couple involved. You picture the bride walking down the aisle, her white gown shining in the sunlight, the air filled with the scent of flowers, and, let's be real, everyone looking their best. But in the medieval world, that fresh, clean feeling that we associate with weddings didn't quite exist. Instead, the wedding day was less about looking pristine and more about simply surviving the event. Because let's face it, In the 14th century, personal hygiene was not top of the wedding checklist. The first clue that bathing wasn't a priority on a medieval wedding day? The fact that weddings, particularly among peasants, were often scheduled at the last minute, which didn't leave much time for personal grooming. Imagine this. You're a peasant, and you've spent months working the land, tending to animals, and barely scraping by. When your big day comes, you're probably lucky if you've had a chance to wash off a few days' worth of dirt, sweat, and, well, other things. But even if you had time to squeeze in a quick bath, it wasn't exactly a spa day. A bath meant a quick scrub with whatever water was available, probably shared with the local livestock, and any hope of cleanliness was really just a hope. But that didn't mean there wasn't some effort to appear fresh. For the wealthy, weddings were seen as a social spectacle, so there was at least an attempt at making the bride and groom look presentable in their own medieval way. Wealthier brides might have had access to better water, soaps, and more luxurious items like perfumes. However, it wasn't the romantic, lavender-scented luxury we dream of today. Instead, these perfumes were often heavy, pungent mixtures of herbs and animal fats meant to cover up the overwhelming stench of medieval life, sweat, manure, and the unbathed masses. Here's the kicker. Bathing before your wedding was actually discouraged by some medieval traditions. In some places, brides and grooms would undergo a ritual cleansing before the wedding, but it wasn't about personal hygiene. It was about purifying the couple for the sacrament of marriage. This cleansing didn't involve soap, water, or scrubbing away grime. It was more about the couple going through a religious ceremony, often involving a blessing by the priest that had more to do with spiritual cleanliness than anything physically hygienic. So instead of freshening up, the couple was essentially performing a ceremonial ritual that was supposed to cleanse them of sin rather than dirt. And even when weddings were more than just a quick ceremony, the idea of cleanliness wasn't exactly clean. The fact is, medieval folk didn't bathe regularly, so on the big day, most people were simply trying to appear decent enough for the ceremony, but they weren't concerned about smelling fresh or looking spotless. The clothing itself often helped disguise any lingering smells. Bridal gowns were usually made from thick fabrics, like wool or linen, which, let's face it, weren't breathable. This might have been good for hiding any undesirable odors, but not so much for comfort. Imagine trying to move around on your wedding day in a heavy, uncomfortably warm gown, all while praying that your partner wouldn't get too close and notice the smell of a long day's labor. Even the wedding feast was more about endurance than enjoyment. The medieval wedding was, in many ways, a feast of excess, with food piled high on the table. But unlike today, where weddings are often a time for fresh, refined dishes, medieval feasts could have been greasy, overly spiced, and, well, a bit too rich. And the idea of keeping things hygienic or elegant was about as foreign to the medieval mindset as personal space. After all, people ate with their hands, wiped their mouths with whatever they had handy, often a sleeve or a rough napkin, and if you were really lucky, the wine might have been able to drown out the rest of the unpleasantness. It's important to note that the tradition of getting clean before a wedding wasn't so much about personal hygiene as it was about marking a new chapter of life. The concept of cleanliness was intertwined with social rituals, religion, and the need for survival, rather than a focus on looking pristine. The wedding day, while a grand event, was more of an opportunity to survive it without becoming too aware of your own discomfort, or worse, the stench of your unwashed clothes and body. So the next time you're at a wedding with everything perfectly orchestrated, the pristine dresses, the soft lighting, the flower-filled air, take a moment to appreciate how far we've come. Back in the medieval world, the idea of hygiene and cleanliness was drastically different, and while the couple might have looked radiant in their wedding finery, it wasn't because they had access to sparkling water or luxurious soaps. No, they were simply putting their best foot forward, hoping that the holy nature of the ceremony would make the rest of it tolerable. Forget fresh flowers. Let's hope the bride didn't bring too much of the barn to the party. Showers? In the medieval world? Please. The closest thing they had to a shower was an outdoor wash basin that you shared with every other villager. Imagine the chaos. Let's think about it for a second. In the modern world, a shower is almost a sacred part of our daily routine. It's where we wake up, wash off the day's stress, and feel human again. But if you were living in medieval times, the idea of a shower as we know it would be about as realistic as owning a flying horse. There were no private bathrooms, no hot water running from a fancy shower head, and definitely no rubber duckies. Instead, if you wanted to clean yourself up, you were stuck with an outdoor wash basin, and everyone in your village probably shared it. This was your version of personal hygiene, a communal water-sharing experience, where the line between cleanliness and discomfort blurred in ways that modern sensibilities just can't comprehend. The process wasn't about privacy or comfort. The wash basin, probably located near the village well or some other communal water source, was used for everything from cleaning your hands to washing off the dirt of the day. If you were a peasant, you probably didn't have the luxury of a separate, personal space to wash up. So imagine yourself standing in line, waiting for your turn at the wash basin, your fellow villagers around you, some of whom had probably just been tending to livestock or working the fields. You weren't exactly getting the spa treatment. Instead, you were rubbing dirt off with a cloth, likely shared by everyone else in the village, and hoping that you weren't transferring more germs to your skin than you were getting rid of. Now, the real fun came with the fact that you weren't alone in this process. Everyone in the village used the same wash basin: children, adults, the elderly, and sometimes even the local animals, because why not? The same water you used to wash your face might have just been used to rinse off some muddy boots or the grimy hands of your neighbor. Oh, and don't forget that rivers, which often acted as the public washing space, weren't exactly clean either. You're essentially standing in a huge communal sink where the clean water is probably mixed with whatever the village has decided to throw in there that day. And just to make it even worse, because there were no separate spaces, you'd have to wash up in front of your neighbors. Privacy wasn't exactly in the cards. The concept of personal space was an afterthought. Imagine standing in line, maybe getting splashed by some water, all while trying to avoid making eye contact with the person who had been washing their dirty tunic just before you. And what about the water itself? Let's not kid ourselves. It wasn't like the refreshing filtered water we get from our taps today. The water in these wash basins or communal wells was often murky, and there was no such thing as purification systems. You might have been lucky enough to get a splash of water that was fresh, but chances are it was shared with everyone in the village. And if there was a river nearby, that was your best shot for washing off. But remember, that water might have been used for drinking, bathing, laundry, and sometimes even sewage disposal. So when you stepped into the river to clean up, you were probably getting more than you bargained for. The lack of modern plumbing meant that even the process of getting water was an ordeal. You had to walk to the local well or stream, carry your water back, and then hope that the little you managed to collect would be enough for the washing, cooking, and drinking for the day. So when it came to personal hygiene, it was all about rationing your water. You weren't going to waste it on a leisurely shower, especially if you had an entire family to take care of and share with. Water usage was a serious matter, practical and survival focused, not about comfort or cleanliness. And let's not even talk about the luxuries like soap. Even if you had soap, it was often just animal fat mixed with ash, which didn't exactly create the foamy lather we expect today. You were more likely to get a rough scrub with whatever cloth you had, and then stand in line for the next person to do the same. A lot of medieval hygiene was about surviving the day, not about achieving that post-shower glow. The absence of showers or proper baths wasn't just about lack of convenience. It was about a completely different cultural approach to cleanliness. It wasn't about getting fresh, it was about getting by. People didn't expect to feel clean the way we do today. Instead, they accepted their conditions and did the best they could with what was available. There was no expectation of freshness, no sense of luxury, and certainly no me time in the form of a hot shower. So the next time you step into your beautifully tiled shower with the water temperature just right and your favorite body wash gently cleansing away the day, remember that your medieval ancestors didn't have it so easy. They were washing up in communal spaces, dealing with water that had been shared by everyone in the village, and they were lucky if they didn't catch a disease along the way. Modern plumbing and personal privacy, a luxury they could only dream of. So yeah, maybe take a moment to appreciate that water bill. You've earned it. The idea of months without a bath sounds like torture, right? But for medieval folks, it wasn't even a thought. If you were lucky, you got a dip in the river, but mostly it was a get used to the smell situation. Let's be honest, the concept of personal hygiene in the medieval world wasn't exactly something people thought much about. It wasn't like they wanted to be filthy, but they didn't have the luxury of modern showers, soap, or any of the other comforts we associate with cleanliness today. So if you were a medieval peasant, the thought of going months without a bath wasn't just a harsh reality, it was normal. Hygiene wasn't seen as a regular part of daily life. Instead, it was a sporadic event, and sometimes a complete afterthought. For the average person in medieval Europe, taking a bath was a rare occasion, one that depended on availability, time, and let's face it, just plain luck. You might have had the opportunity to take a quick dip in the local rivers or wash your face with whatever water you could get your hands on, but a full body wash? That was more of a special event. If you were lucky enough to have access to a communal bathhouse, you'd share the same dirty water with your fellow villagers. And even if you did get a chance to wash, it wasn't like you were scrubbing away dirt in warm, clean water. You were basically hoping for the best with whatever murky water you had. The truth is, most of the time, you were just stuck with the smell, especially if you had no other option. Think about it. After days, weeks, or even months of working the land, tending animals, and living in close quarters with your family and livestock, your body would naturally accumulate dirt, sweat, and, well, a lot of other things you'd rather not think about. But the thing is, in the medieval world, there was no easy fix for that. If you were stuck in a situation where a bath wasn't available, there were no wet wipes, no deodorants, no dry shampoo, just a quick rinse with whatever water you could manage. Even when a bath was an option, it wasn't a matter of hopping into a pristine tub of hot water with soothing aromas and bubbles. A bath was more of a try not to die from the bacteria in the water situation. So what happens when you don't bathe for months? Well, first off, you've got a real fragrance issue on your hands. The buildup of sweat and body oils on your skin would start to combine with dirt, and that lovely mixture, it would become a breeding ground for bacteria. You weren't just smelling bad, you were basically creating your own personal scent of decay. It's not that medieval people didn't care, it was more that they simply didn't have the tools to care. The idea of smelling clean was as foreign as the idea of bathing every day. But when you're living in a world where survival was the main priority, cleanliness wasn't something you could afford to dwell on. Then there's the fun of lice and fleas. Without proper hygiene, bugs were a common problem. Lice were especially prevalent, and the more you went without bathing, the more likely you were to invite these delightful little creatures into your hair. But lice weren't just an annoyance, they could spread diseases. So in addition to the awful smell and discomfort, you were also living with the risk of getting sick, all because you didn't have access to a regular bath. That lovely head of yours that had been caked in dirt for weeks was probably also a prime location for a family of lice to move in. And don't even get started on the skin problems. Medieval people, especially peasants, didn't have the luxury of modern skincare, and when you're living without regular baths, it can lead to all sorts of skin issues. Imagine being covered in a layer of oils, dirt, and sweat for months on end. You could expect to develop rashes, sores, and other skin irritations. Plus, the lack of cleaning meant that any cuts or scrapes could easily become infected, again, with no antibiotics to help you out. It wasn't just about discomfort, it was about survival. If you did happen to get a wound, it wasn't a quick trip to the doctor. It was more of a cross your fingers and hope situation. Infections were common, and the lack of basic hygiene just made them worse. But there was one thing you could count on: the stench. While you might have gotten used to it, everyone around you definitely noticed. Your family, your neighbors, your fellow workers, they all had to live with the smell of you, just as you had to live with theirs. And let's not forget the challenge of living in close quarters. There were no private spaces, no me time where you could escape and freshen up. Personal space wasn't a thing. Everyone was stuck in the same environment, living and working together in a shared stench of sweat, livestock, and the occasional, hopefully washed face. So the next time you step into your warm, fragrant shower, feeling the water wash away the stress of the day, take a moment to appreciate how lucky you are. Because in the medieval world, going months without a bath was just a part of life. Hygiene was a luxury few could afford, and getting clean was just a dream, not a reality. The smell was a constant reminder that survival came first, and the luxury of feeling fresh was something most people could only imagine. When you cram hundreds of people into a steam-filled room, what's the worst that could happen? Oh, just the spread of diseases, infections, and bad personal hygiene. No biggie, right? Let's set the stage for a typical medieval bathhouse. These places were designed as communal hubs where the people of the town could gather, wash off the grime of the day, and hopefully come out feeling a little fresher than before. Sounds great in theory, right? Unfortunately, in practice, they were anything but relaxing. Bathhouses were often overcrowded, steamy, and filled with all kinds of unpleasant surprises. Imagine sharing a cramped, sweaty space with strangers, many of whom hadn't bathed in days or even weeks. If you think your gym's locker room is bad, imagine it with no private stalls, a whole lot more body odor, and the distinct smell of human waste wafting through the air. But it wasn't just the stink that was the problem. Bathhouses were a breeding ground for disease. Without its modern plumbing, filtration, or even basic sanitation, the water in these communal baths could get downright dangerous. The concept of personal hygiene wasn't exactly a priority. Most people were there just to scrub off the most visible layers of grime. There was no such thing as keeping your bathwater clean, so the water was shared by everyone who could afford the fee to use it. And, unlike today's spas where each person has their own clean, sanitized space, medieval bathhouses were often used by people who had been working in the fields, handling animals, or living in close quarters without access to any real form of personal cleanliness. You can already see where this is going, can't you? The problem wasn't just the filth that accumulated in the water, it was also the sheer number of people. Hundreds of individuals might squeeze into these bathhouses at any given time. The water wasn't changed frequently, if at all, meaning that with each new person who entered, the excess water became more and more contaminated. As people rinsed off, sweat and oils mixed with the water, leaving a murky, greasy concoction that no one should have been exposed to. Imagine submerging yourself in water that's been used by dozens, if not hundreds, of people. What could possibly go wrong? Well, plenty. The lack of proper sanitation made bathhouses the perfect environment for the spread of infections and diseases. Lice, fleas, and other parasites were rampant, and they loved the humid, damp conditions of the bathhouse. In fact, you could practically guarantee that if you spent any length of time in one, you'd leave with a few new friends crawling around in your hair. Beyond the bugs, the bathhouse was a hotspot for more serious diseases. In an age without antibiotics or even basic knowledge of germ theory, it wasn't hard for a simple scratch or open wound to become infected with bacteria. People were often washing in the same water, so if someone had an infection, it could easily spread to others in a matter of minutes. And then there were the public health concerns. It was common for people to wash their clothes in the same bathwater they used for bathing. Imagine that. You've just washed yourself in water that's shared by dozens of people, and then your clothes go into the same water. You're now doubly contaminated. To make matters worse, the bathhouses weren't just places to get clean. They were social centers where people gathered to chat, gossip, and socialize. People spent a lot of time in the baths, and while they were trying to cleanse their bodies, they weren't necessarily cleansing their minds. It was the medieval version of a crowded pool party, but with far more bacteria than you'd ever want to imagine. Now you might be thinking, but surely these bathhouses were regulated, right? Unfortunately, no. There wasn't much oversight when it came to bathhouse cleanliness or health standards because people didn't have the understanding of disease transmission that we do today. The idea that water could harbor disease was still centuries away from being discovered. Bathhouses often functioned more like a social service, with little to no concern for hygiene or disease prevention. To make matters even worse, many bathhouses were also used for other purposes, like prostitution. It wasn't unusual for a bathhouse to double as a brothel, which, while adding to the social aspect of the experience, didn't exactly promote health or safety. And let's not forget the steam. The heat and humidity in these bathhouses weren't controlled, which meant that the atmosphere could quickly become unbearable. While a hot steam room might sound relaxing, imagine being in a room so steamy and overcrowded that you can barely breathe, and the air smells like a mixture of sweat, mold, and who knows what else. The steam could make things feel a bit more luxurious, but it also made it easier for germs to flourish. So what's the takeaway here? Bathhouses were a necessary evil in the medieval world, but they weren't exactly places of relaxation and cleanliness. They were overcrowded, unsanitary, and probably contributed to more health problems than they solved. If you were lucky, you might have come out feeling a little less filthy, but you were probably leaving with some unwanted guests like lice or fleas and who knows what else. So the next time you step into your sanitized, temperature-controlled shower, just take a moment to appreciate how far we've come. The medieval bathhouse experience was a far cry from the luxury we enjoy today, unless, of course, you're into sharing bathwater with hundreds of strangers and possibly contracting a few medieval diseases along the way. Let's talk about the most unspeakable part of medieval bathing, peeing in the bath. It wasn't frowned upon back then. Heck, it was expected. Get ready to cringe as we dive into this awkward situation. Now, when we think about taking a bath today, we probably imagine a relaxing experience. Warm water, maybe a few candles, some bubbles, and the peace of solitude. But imagine you're back in the 14th century, in a crowded, steamy communal bathhouse. It's filled with people, some of whom haven't bathed in days, others who've come straight from the fields, covered in dirt and sweat. The air is thick with the smell of humans, animals, and water that has been shared by everyone in town. Nobody's really concerned about germs, and the concept of personal hygiene is a distant dream. Now imagine you're standing there, trying to enjoy whatever meager cleansing you can manage when the urge hits. Yes, the urge to pee. And guess what? You're not alone. The medieval bathhouse was packed, and many people didn't have the luxury of stepping out and finding a private spot to relieve themselves. In fact, it was practically normal to just pee in the water. There was no polite excuse to step out, no hold it mentality. If you needed to go, you did it right there in the bath. After all, who was going to notice? Everyone was in the same boat, or rather, the same murky bathwater. So you'd relieve yourself and carry on as if it was just another part of the daily ritual. The water wasn't just for washing, it was essentially a communal toilet, too. But hold on, it gets worse. Not only was it totally acceptable to pee in the bath, but it was expected. The communal bath was such a vital part of medieval social life that it was more about getting clean enough to function than it was about actual cleanliness. People didn't worry too much about the fact that everyone was sharing the same water. To the medieval mind, you weren't just bathing to clean yourself. You were participating in a communal ritual, a social event that included chatting, gossiping, and yes, peeing in the same water. It was a get in and get out situation, so peeing in the bath was more about practicality than hygiene. People simply didn't have the same concept of cleanliness we take for granted today. Of course, for the wealthy, the experience was a bit more private by medieval standards. They might have had their own baths in their castles or estates, where the water was probably a little cleaner than in the public baths. But even then, the idea of fresh water wasn't really part of the equation. Noblemen and women might still be dealing with murky water, albeit slightly more luxurious murk, and the opportunity for a discreet pee was still a possibility. What's the harm? It's just one more natural part of the experience. And then there was the effect of all this shared water. Imagine a bath that's been used by dozens of people, each of whom has washed, sweat, and peed in the same water. That water, already full of dirt and oils from people's skin, became a perfect breeding ground for bacteria. Medieval people, lacking any understanding of germs or disease transmission, didn't realize that this seemingly harmless practice could spread lice, fleas, or even more dangerous infections. But to them, it didn't matter. The concept of sanitation was just in its infancy, so the idea of clean water wasn't something they were concerned with. As long as they were rinsing off, that was good enough. This wasn't just a bathhouse issue. In the medieval world, personal space was hard to come by. Even in private homes, water for bathing was often shared by the whole family, and that included a very casual approach to relieving yourself. Going to the bathroom wasn't as formal as it is today. There were no indoor toilets, unless you were particularly lucky, so people took care of business wherever they could, sometimes even in the water they'd use to bathe. It wasn't just the bathhouses, it was a way of life. The fact that people didn't think much of this practice shows just how normalized it was for them. Hygiene wasn't about freshness, it was about survival. In fact, this practice didn't completely disappear in the medieval world. It lingered, even into the Renaissance period. People didn't begin to separate bathing from using the toilet until much later in history, when better sanitation practices started to develop. It wasn't until much later that people started to realize the connection between cleanliness and health, and even longer before the modern concept of not peeing in the bath became the norm. So what does this tell us? The medieval approach to hygiene was about as different from ours as night and day. The act of bathing itself was less about cleanliness and more about survival, getting by, and taking part in a shared experience. The idea of hygiene being tied to health was still centuries away, and practices like peeing in the bath were just part of daily life. Next time you step into your own private, clean, modern shower or bath, be thankful for the conveniences you have today, especially the ability to use the bathroom without sharing your water with 100 other people. You don't have to worry about diseases, bacteria, or awkwardly holding it while surrounded by your neighbors. In short, medieval bathhouses weren't just places to clean yourself, they were where personal hygiene went to die. Ever wonder why bathing wasn't a big deal in the medieval period? Look no further than the Black Death, which effectively killed off any semblance of hygiene for centuries. Bathing? Who had time for that? The Black Death, which swept through Europe in the 14th century, was not just a horrifying disease in its own right. It had a profound impact on how people thought about cleanliness, health, and hygiene. At the time, the medieval world was already struggling with basic concepts of sanitation. The connection between hygiene and disease wasn't understood, and people lived in a state of constant filth, working, eating, and sleeping in close quarters, with little regard for personal cleanliness. The Black Death, however, made the already poor hygiene conditions much worse. When the plague hit, people were desperate. Entire towns and villages were devastated, and with a death toll that wiped out anywhere from 1/3 to half of Europe's population, the world as they knew it was falling apart. Amid this crisis, people's priorities shifted dramatically. Survival took precedence over everything else, including the luxury of regular bathing. After all, who could focus on scrubbing themselves clean when they were more concerned with staying alive? The concept of hygiene, already low on the list of priorities, was tossed aside completely. In a world where death was a constant, unpredictable companion, a bath just seemed irrelevant, especially when a single breath of bad air could be enough to bring the plague to your door. Moreover, medieval people had no understanding of how diseases spread. They believed that illness was caused by bad air or miasma, foul smells in the environment. So when the Black Death struck, many people didn't make the connection between disease and hygiene. Instead, they thought that if you bathed, you were opening your pores to the very bad air that was thought to carry the plague. In fact, some even believed that bathing made the body more vulnerable to sickness, opening up a person's skin to the poisonous air. In a strange twist of logic, they thought that avoiding baths would somehow protect them from disease. The very act of washing was believed to expose you to the deadly vapors of the plague. So naturally, bathing became even more of a rarity during and after the outbreak. This belief wasn't just some fringe idea, it was widespread. Medical authorities and even church officials warned against bathing, claiming it could lead to more harm than good. So instead of cleansing themselves, people focused on other forms of protection. They turned to herbal remedies, charms, and prayers, anything they could grasp in the face of the unknowable, uncontrollable threat of the plague. And what about the poor hygiene practices that were already commonplace? Well, those became worse. With so much death, so many people avoiding communal bathhouses, and the general collapse of infrastructure, public hygiene took a nosedive. If anything, the Black Death further normalized the idea that cleanliness was irrelevant and possibly dangerous. But it didn't just stop with the Black Death. In the years following the plague, the stigma around bathing became entrenched in European culture. The fear of open pores and bad air continued to grow, and without understanding the link between cleanliness and disease prevention, people didn't make the connection between the lack of baths and the continuation of epidemics. Instead, they just lived with the smell, the dirt, and the pests that came with it. So instead of focusing on regular bathing or other methods of maintaining hygiene, medieval society moved into a new way of life, where the avoidance of bathing became a norm. Public bathhouses, which were once central to social life, were now seen as places to be avoided. The idea of cleanliness was relegated to the background, replaced by superstitions and more pressing survival tactics. You can imagine how that worked out: shared water, shared illnesses, and a perpetuation of the very conditions that allowed the plague to thrive. It wasn't until centuries later that the link between cleanliness and health started to become more apparent. By then, the medieval habit of avoiding baths had left an indelible mark on hygiene practices, with many people still wary of bathing and water for centuries after the Black Death. In fact, it wasn't until the Enlightenment and beyond that the modern concept of personal hygiene, along with its connection to preventing disease, began to take root in Europe. So the next time you step into your clean, private shower, surrounded by your favorite soaps and shower gels, just remember, the Black Death effectively set the world back on hygiene for centuries. Instead of focusing on staying clean and healthy, people were caught in a cycle of superstition and fear that prolonged the suffering. The idea of a bath, as we know it today, was far from the minds of people living through the plague, and when personal hygiene was seen as a threat rather than a necessity, it's no wonder that the stench of medieval life became the ultimate survival tactic. In medieval times, hot water was more of a luxury than a necessity. Only the richest could afford the privilege of actually enjoying a bath in comfort. For everyone else, cold, murky water was all you got. Now let's think about a typical medieval bath. For most people, bathing wasn't a relaxing, enjoyable experience. It was more about getting by than it was about comfort. The wealthy might have had access to the occasional hot bath, but for the majority, it was a much less luxurious affair. You'd gather your water from a local well or river, and if you were lucky, the water would be somewhat clean, although let's be honest, it was probably already contaminated with whatever happened to be floating around that day. And if you wanted a bath that wasn't downright freezing, you had to get creative. The idea of hot water, as we know it today, was a distant dream for most of the population. Hot water, as we think of it, simply didn't exist for the common folk. The closest they could get to a warm bath was either a heated stone placed in a wooden tub, or more often, a dip in a river or public bath. Even these options weren't all that reliable. Imagine having to make do with a basin of cold, murky water after a long, hard day of manual labor. Not exactly the spa day we dream of today, right? But let's focus on the wealthy. For those at the top of the social ladder, having access to hot water was a true luxury, one that allowed them to enjoy a bath in comfort without the biting cold. Nobles and royals didn't have to settle for frigid water. Instead, they could have their servants heat water in large cauldrons, which would then be poured into their lavish bathtubs. These tubs were usually made of wood or metal and could hold enough water to cover their entire body. For them, the bath was a means of relaxation, a way to clean up after the day's events, and often an opportunity for socialization. But even for the wealthy, this was still a cumbersome process. Having hot water brought to your bath wasn't a simple affair. It required a lot of preparation, effort, and of course, a hefty amount of servants. If you think about the typical bathing experience for the nobility, it's quite different from our modern carefree routines. For one, there were no private bathrooms. The bath wasn't something you just hopped into whenever you felt like it. It required a lot of time, effort, and above all, resources. The water had to be carefully measured, boiled, and carried to the tub, sometimes in several trips. So while the nobility enjoyed the luxury of hot water, it wasn't something that was available on demand. It was more of an occasional treat than a regular part of their day. But let's take a moment to appreciate what this means. For the wealthiest people of the medieval world, hot water was precious. They had to rely on a team of servants to bring it to them, and when they bathed, it was almost an event in itself. They weren't just washing off dirt, they were participating in a ritual that took effort and coordination. In contrast, for the common folk, there was no such thing as hot water. You had to make do with what you had, and what you had was likely cold, dirty water that was shared with others in a public bath, or even in a river. Even for those who could afford a bit more luxury, the idea of hot water didn't mean a temperature-controlled shower or a relaxing soak in the tub. It was a basic necessity, and even then it wasn't consistent. Water temperature varied based on how well the servants heated it or the time of year. You could be lucky and get a warm bath, or you could be stuck with a freezing dip that did little to ease your aches and pains. For most people, This process was just a means to survive, to wash off the grime of the day and hope that no disease would take hold of you from the dirty, shared water. On top of all this, medieval people weren't exactly bathing for pleasure. The concept of self-care wasn't a thing. Bathing was about survival. If you didn't bathe regularly, you risked infection, lice, and even worse. So the ritual of bathing was less about relaxation and more about avoiding disease. Even for the wealthiest individuals, their lavish hot baths were still part of a larger social and health ritual, not a luxury we associate with pampering. So next time you enjoy the simple pleasure of a hot shower or bath, think about how far we've come. Hot water is no longer a luxury. It's something most of us take for granted. The medieval world, by contrast, was a place where hot water was precious, reserved for the few, and the process of getting it was a far cry from the ease and comfort we enjoy today. For the peasants, there was no comfort, just cold, murky water, and the hope that they could survive another day without succumbing to the inevitable dirt and disease that came with their lack of access to clean water. Getting out of a medieval bath was about as pleasant as the bath itself. After submerging yourself in water that wasn't exactly clean, the drying process usually involved a rough towel and an even rougher body scrub. Now let's break down what happens after you've finally gotten out of the bath, or at least the communal water source that you hoped would cleanse you. The bath itself might have been less than relaxing. Whether you were dunking yourself in a cold river, a public bathhouse filled with a murky cocktail of sweat, grime, and animal residue, or just trying to rinse off with water. You boiled yourself, you weren't exactly walking out feeling refreshed. In fact, after dipping yourself into that cloudy, unfiltered water, you were probably just looking forward to getting out of it. But the real fun began once you stepped out. Drying off was a completely different nightmare. Forget the soft, plush towels we use today to pamper ourselves after a nice soak. The best you could hope for in the medieval world was a rough, scratchy cloth, if you were lucky. And let's face it, that cloth wasn't exactly fresh. It had been used by multiple family members, and probably by the neighbor's dog too, to dry off after their own communal bath experiences. The fabric was stiff, abrasive, and not at all comfortable. Instead of feeling soft against your skin, it felt like it was doing more scrubbing than drying. And after all that dirt and grime had been loosened in the water, that rough towel probably only did one thing: spread it around. In fact, the towel wasn't the only tool in your post-bath cleanup kit. If you were really unlucky, you'd have to contend with a body scrub that was even worse than the towel itself. Medieval people weren't exactly worried about exfoliating the right way. Instead, they used whatever they could find to rub their skin down, often with a cloth, sometimes with a wooden scraper, or maybe a rough brush. This was the medieval equivalent of trying to scrub a layer of dirt off your skin, and it wasn't delicate. You'd end up with scratches, bruises, and a good amount of skin irritation in the process. You weren't exactly leaving the bath feeling refreshed. You were probably just feeling sore and sticky. Now let's talk about the real fun, the smell. After all that work to try and get rid of the grime, you probably didn't end up smelling much better. The water you used for your bath wasn't exactly clean to begin with, and the towel you used wasn't exactly going to help remove whatever leftover bacteria or odors were clinging to your skin. While you might have hoped for a fresh, clean scent, what you were left with was likely more of the same, a lingering stench of unwashed body and whatever fragrance came from the animal fats and herbs used to make your soap. You weren't exactly leaving the bathhouse or river feeling like a new person, you were just less dirty. But it wasn't just about the smell or discomfort. The whole process of getting clean was as much about survival as it was about hygiene. You didn't have the luxury of hopping out of a hot tub and slipping into a fluffy bathrobe or lounging in soft towels. Instead, you were probably left to dry off quickly before putting on the same clothes you had been wearing for days, or, if you were lucky, for a few hours. Your clothes, like your towel, probably weren't new or clean either. They had likely been worn for long stretches without being washed. So when you put your clothes back on after that rough scrub down, you weren't exactly getting the freshly laundered feel. Instead, it was just more of the same, sweaty, grimy, and uncomfortably layered on top of your just washed skin. But to make matters even worse, in medieval times, most people didn't have a proper change of clothes to throw on, so you had to wear whatever you had, perhaps the same dirty tunic or cloak that you had been wearing for days or even weeks. And those garments, it's like everything else in medieval life, were likely shared with multiple family members and possibly the livestock. So the process of getting out of the bath didn't make you feel rejuvenated or fresh. It was just a temporary fix before you had to put on your dirty, used clothing again. It wasn't the luxurious experience we're used to today, but there was a silver lining in all of this, kind of. For medieval people, this whole process of washing and drying off wasn't meant to make them feel like they were glowing with freshness. It was about surviving. Personal hygiene wasn't about looking your best. It was about doing the best you could with the resources you had. And most of the time, those resources were sparse. So after your bath, or your bath as it was, when you finished drying off, you could at least feel some semblance of accomplishment. You'd survived the process, and maybe you'd gotten rid of a little dirt along the way. So the next time you step out of a relaxing shower with your soft, fluffy towel waiting to wrap you in comfort, remember the medieval experience. The bath might have been grueling, uncomfortable, and possibly unsanitary, but for many people in the past, it was the closest they could get to cleanliness. It's a reminder that while we might take our clean, comfortable post-shower rituals for granted today, people of the past were just trying to make it through another day of dirt, discomfort, and a lack of basic hygiene. And maybe, just maybe, we should appreciate our modern-day comforts a little more. We've heard a lot of myths about medieval hygiene, like the fact that people didn't even bathe. Spoiler alert, they did, but not exactly how we'd want to. Time to debunk the biggest myths and figure out what's real. First, let's address the biggest myth about medieval hygiene, that people didn't bathe at all. It's an idea that's been perpetuated by films, books, and let's face it, just general laziness in the research department. The truth is, people in the medieval world did bathe sometimes. But, and this is important, their version of bathing wasn't the same as what we think of today. We're talking about a world where clean water was scarce, soap wasn't widely available, and plumbing was a distant dream. So no, they didn't take long, relaxing showers every day like we do, or frankly, any showers at all, but they did engage in forms of cleanliness. One popular misconception is that medieval folk were totally against bathing because they believed it would make them sick. While some later medieval beliefs around bathing were influenced by the idea that baths could make you vulnerable to bad air or disease, especially after the Black Death, bathing was still a common practice for a large part of the medieval period. In fact, it wasn't until the late Middle Ages and the Renaissance that bathing began to take on a negative connotation in Europe, particularly with the rise of concerns about bad air and the connection to plague. But early medieval people used communal bathhouses, rivers, and even wash basins to clean themselves as best as they could. The catch, of course, was that their concept of cleanliness didn't align with our modern obsession with sterilization. These baths were shared by everyone, often reused for multiple purposes, and hygiene wasn't as much about health as it was about the appearance of cleanliness. The second big myth we need to bust is the idea that medieval people never washed their hands or faces. While it's true that hygiene was pretty minimal, it wasn't completely disregarded. Medieval people did wash their hands before meals, especially in noble households or religious settings where cleanliness was more highly valued. They used wash basins and sometimes even herbs or rough cloths to clean their faces and hands. Sure, it wasn't as thorough or as frequent as we would like, but people did clean themselves to some degree. They just didn't have the luxury of warm running water and soap whenever they needed it. For the peasantry, washing with whatever water they could find was more about survival than comfort. Next, let's talk about the myth of the stinky medieval person who never changed clothes or washed. While it's easy to assume that everyone stunk in the past, there were actually some methods used to reduce odors. Medieval people may not have had modern deodorant, but they were familiar with herbs, spices, and perfumes. In fact, nobles often used perfumes made from herbs like lavender, rosemary, and even rosewater to cover up body odors. They might have smelled more like a potpourri than like fresh flowers, but at least they tried. As for changing clothes, it's true that medieval people didn't have the same wardrobe flexibility we do today, but they did have spare clothes, and they did wash them in rivers or communal washing areas when they could. However, with the lack of fabric technology and the difficulty of washing, it wasn't uncommon for clothes to be worn for extended periods of time. As a result, people could go for long stretches without changing into something fresh. But let's not sugarcoat it. There were definitely some hygiene practices that were less than ideal. In the medieval world, there wasn't much of a concept of deodorizing, exfoliating, or any of the luxuries we associate with modern cleanliness. Instead, medieval hygiene was about doing the best with what you had. Bathing was an occasional activity, and the use of harsh scrubbing tools or communal water sources was more about survival than comfort. People lived in a world where constant access to clean water and soap wasn't a guarantee, and what they thought was clean was just less dirty. Public bathhouses, for instance, were a social and cleansing experience, but they were far from sanitary by modern standards. Shared water, no real soap, and a lack of personal space meant that everyone left feeling maybe cleaner, but not exactly fresh. Another fun myth to address is that medieval people were somehow completely unaware of basic sanitation. Again, this is an oversimplification. While it's true that they didn't have modern waste disposal systems, some medieval towns did have public latrines or even sewer systems, especially in more advanced areas like Rome or later medieval cities. People knew the importance of cleanliness, but they didn't have the scientific understanding we have today. If you lived in a larger city, you might have been more likely to encounter some form of sanitation, but for those living in rural areas, waste was often disposed of in rivers or just left in the streets. But even this wasn't entirely ignorant. They knew enough to avoid building homes over cesspits or to keep waste away from food sources, just not with the level of sophistication that came much later. The bottom line is this: medieval hygiene wasn't as horrifying as the myths suggest, but it also wasn't as polished as our modern hygiene routines. People washed, they cleaned, they tried to stay fresh, but without the resources we have today, it was always more about getting by than getting clean. The medieval world did have bathing and personal care, but it was less about luxury and more about basic survival. So next time you step into your perfectly clean shower, just remember, medieval folk were doing the best they could with a whole lot less. So there you have it, the medieval world, where hygiene was less about luxury and more about getting by, surviving, and doing the best with what you had. The idea of a relaxing bath, personal space, and fragrant cleanliness was a distant dream for most people back then. Instead, it was about sharing water, enduring discomfort, and hoping that a quick scrub would be enough to make it through the day without attracting too much attention for the wrong reasons. But here's the thing: despite all the hardships and grimy realities, people in the medieval era were resilient. They made it through plagues, poor sanitation, and a complete lack of modern conveniences, all while still finding ways to socialize, enjoy life, and even get a little clean when they could. They didn't have the luxury of daily showers, soft towels, or clean filtered water at the turn of a tap, but they still found ways to survive. And in a strange way, their ability to cope with such discomfort shows just how adaptable and tenacious the human spirit can be. So tonight, as you tuck into your clean bed with hot water and indoor plumbing, maybe whisper a quiet thank you to your ancestors. After all, they survived without all the comforts we take for granted. They lived with the dirt, the discomfort, and the diseases, yet somehow they managed to carry on. In a world of rough towels, murky water, and communal baths, they did the best they could. And maybe that's the most important thing we can remember, that even when things were grim, people found a way to keep going, keep living, and keep moving forward. Because history may be gross and terrifying, but it's also proof that people are stubborn, hopeful, and kind of ridiculous. We've come a long way since then, so when you step into your modern-day shower, savor the luxury of clean, warm water and be grateful for the comforts we've earned. Now let's drift off into a peaceful sleep, knowing that, at least for tonight, we've got it pretty good. Okay, good night.